The world will soon face a calamity unlike any other. But you know this. We all know this. This has been foretold for generations, ever since the first explosion shook the planet. The only questions that remain are how many will survive it and who will rule what is left. Luckily, we have time on our side in a very literal sense. So if we want to end up on top, we'll need to leverage our very future in order to succeed. Hey folks, my name is Shay Parker and this is RTFM, the show where I teach you how to play a game. And it looks like I forgot to write a joke for this intro. Maybe the Shay who's finished filming the tutorial can help. Future Shay? Thank you. Hey, I'm Shay Parker. This is RTFM, the show where I teach you how to play a game, because who has the time to read a rule book? Nailed it. And today we're looking at Anachrony by Mind Clash Games. As I alluded to in the beginning, in Anachrony, you control an ideological faction that has survived the Day of Purgation, an apocalyptic event that was only a shadow of the disaster to come. While it has irrevocably changed our world, it has led to the discovery of neutronium, a substance that, when harnessed, allows us to open portals through time and request aid from our future selves. This is necessary because the true impact is coming. The four paths live separately, but in peace, meeting at the capital, the last independent city on Earth. There they prepare for what is to come by sending workers to mine resources, recruit specialists, achieve scientific breakthroughs, and perform many other important tasks. As you play, you'll also build out your faction's homes, making them more self-sufficient. All of these things are necessary because partway through the game, the neutronium asteroid will strike, and you'll have a limited amount of time left to evacuate as many people as you can to your shelter. By the end of the game, one faction will have proven to be the most influential in shaping humanity's future and will become the one true path. And, win the game. Now, in this video, I'll be teaching the base game of Anachrony. However, there are a couple of modules and alternate game modes that I'll cover in a second video that will be exclusive to my Patreon backers for a month. So if you want to get the full experience, consider heading on over and becoming a rules lawyer. And one last thing, my fans are really good at spotting any minor mistakes I might make, so take a look at the description box below because I keep an updated list of any corrections that pop up. Now, let's get started and learn how to play Anachrony. Alright, so there's a lot to do for setup. Mostly involves just putting stuff out so the board looks like this, but there are a few things that'll be different each time. Let's start with the main board. This is the capital, and where each player will be vying for action spaces. If you're playing a 2 or 3 player game, you'll use the side with fewer spaces, otherwise use the 4 player side. The rulebook will tell you about all the tokens and tiles you need to pile up on or near the board, and I'll go over what each of them are about a little later. You'll also need to make stacks of buildings. Separate them by type, shown by color and symbol, shuffle them and place them face up with enough space for a second stack next to each. The anomalies are like buildings, so you can keep them nearby, but they're all the same, so don't worry about shuffling them. Lastly, for the main board, draw 5 endgame scoring cards and display them at the top. Oh, and remove this card from the deck unless you're playing with the Doomsday module. Next, we need to build the timeline by placing 4 timeline tiles in a row, then the impact tile, and 3 tiles after that. Shuffle the Superprojects and place them above each timeline tile, revealing only the first one. After each player has chosen a path, place one of their focus markers beneath the first timeline. Speaking of paths, pick a path. There are 4 to choose from: Harmony, Dominance, Salvation, and Progress, and they do play a little bit differently. Let's say we're choosing the path of Harmony. Grab 2 boards matching your path and one of your 2 leader cards. Both boards are double-sided. For the smaller board, randomly pick which side you'll use. This determines starting resources and endgame scoring. For the larger board, decide as a group whether you'll all use side A or side B. The difference being that side B is slightly asymmetrical for each faction, but side A has only cosmetic differences. Next, we collect our starting resources. These symbols represent either tired or active workers, so place them in their respective columns on your player board. Then place the leader card on the path board, gather our path banner, markers, warp tiles, and exosuits, and place these markers on the morale and time travel tracks. If you have the deluxe Kickstarter version, you'll have the 3D miniature exosuits, and I am jealous. In any case, after everyone is set up and ready to go, whoever has most recently experienced deja vu becomes the first player. Place your path banner on the board right here, and in clockwise order, the other players gain water. The second and third players gain 1 water, and the fourth player gains 2. Once this is all done, you're ready to start playing. A game of Anachrony takes place over 5 to 7 rounds, and each round consists of 6 phases: preparation, paradox, power-up, warp, paction rounds, and cleanup, most of which go pretty quickly. During preparation, you reveal the super project over the next timeline tile, Shift the top building tile over, revealing the next tile for each type and creating a secondary stack of buildings, and draw a card from the worker and resource decks, replacing each supply with what is shown on the card. The paradox phase is a big deal, but I'm going to come back to it after we learn a little bit more about time travel. So next we have the power-up phase. Remember those workers we got at the start of the game? We'll be sending them to the main board to perform actions, but the trip from each path's home base to the capital is super dangerous, so we need to put them in exosuits in order to survive the trip. Luckily, we can power up 3 of them for free, but for each suit after that, we'll need to spend a power core. However, for each space that we don't fill with an exosuit, we'll gain 1 water, so there's a benefit either way. Also, you don't have to pick which worker is going on which suit at this point. We'll save that for the action rounds phase. Up next is the warp phase, and this is where Anachrony's theme really shines through. It's hard to thrive in this crazy mixed up future, and you don't always have the resources you need to get what you want, but there's this one weird trick you learn to get around that. It's called going into debt. And yeah, a lot of games deal with debt, but in Anachrony, you aren't borrowing from a bank or the mafia or whatever. You're borrowing from your future self. That's how I was able to get that hilarious joke in the beginning of the video. The way it works is that during the warp phase, each player will take their warp tiles, secretly pick 1, 2, or 0 tiles, and reveal them simultaneously. The warp tiles go on your current timeline, and whatever you asked for, you get. Easy as that. With a few caveats. Sending a person back in time is a physically taxing experience, so you'll have to pay 1 water for each worker you get. Of course, if you ask for water from the future, you can use that water to pay for the worker. Also, these warp tiles are going to need to be repaid, and I'll go into how you do that a little later, but for now, let's look at what happens when you don't. Going back to the paradox phase, you look at each timeline tile prior to the current one. For each timeline tile with at least 1 warp token, whichever player has the most will have to roll the paradox die and gain 0, 1, or 2 paradox tiles. If you ever get 3 paradoxes, a couple things happen. First off, stop rolling for paradoxes no matter how many warp tiles you still have left. And when all players are done rolling, you may remove any 1 warp tile from the timeline. Next, remove all paradox tokens on your board and gain 1 anomaly. This will cover up one of your leftmost available building slots. Since we haven't built anything yet, there are multiple places this could go, and you get to choose, but if our board looks more like this later in the game, the anomaly will have to go here. If there are no available slots, cover up a building with the anomaly, making the building unavailable. As I'm sure you've gleaned, anomalies are very bad, but you can get rid of them. Again, I'll talk more about that later. Getting back to where we left off, we have the action rounds. Now I'm going to devote the whole next section of the video to the different actions you can take, but let's go over the basics right now. And if you've played worker placement games before, a lot of this is going to be familiar. Like I said, you have to place a worker in an exosuit in order to take an action on the main board, and most action spaces are exclusive. Makes sense, there's only room for 1 exosuit here, but others are hex pool spaces, which means that any number of workers can be sent here over the course of a round. Keep in mind, though, that you can only use active workers to perform actions. Tired workers are unable to contribute to society, and you're going to have to wake them up if you want to get anything done around here. You can do so by sending a worker to the supply action, paying the cost in water shown here on the morale track, thus increasing morale and making it a more expensive action next time. Or you can force your workers by placing a path marker on this side, which lowers your morale but doesn't cost any water. If your morale is at the end of the track, you'll either gain 2 victory points each time you supply, or you'll lose a worker each time you force. The reason I'm talking about these actions is that 1, sending a worker to a space on your player board does not require an exosuit, and 2, whenever you see a circle space, this is a free action. Each one can only be performed once per era, but you can do multiple different free actions before whatever else you do in your turn. Now, when you either can't or don't want to perform any more actions, you'll pass, and when everyone's passed, you'll move on to the next phase, cleanup, which is pretty self-explanatory. Everyone retrieves their workers and exosuits from both boards, placing workers in the sleepy column, with some exceptions that I'll get to later. And it's important to note that if you didn't use all of your exosuits, they won't carry over to the next era. It's either use them or lose them. Then you'll check for impact or the end of the game. The impact occurs if the impact tile is next on the timeline, but I'll go over that and the end game at the end of the video. Either way, move everyone's path token to the next timeline tile and start the next era. Alright, now let's get into the meat of the game, the actions. Alright, this is a worker placement game, so let's get to work. And let's start by looking at our workforce. There are 4 types of workers: scientists, engineers, administrators, and geniuses. The first 3 are good at certain specific things, whereas the genius, when performing actions, can count as any other type of worker. Let me show you why that's important by looking at our first action, construct. Let's say at the beginning of the game we want to build something. So we take a worker, a scientist, we put it on one of our exosuits and bring it to town. you'll see there are 3 spaces for this action. The first time someone takes it, it's free, but after that, you'll have to pay the water cost shown in the hex. So we've taken our scientist here, and now we can choose a building on top of any stack and build it. The cost for each building is shown on our player board. Let's build a life support system, meaning that the cost is 2 titanium. But here's where the worker's type comes into play. Scientists are okay at building things, but engineers are great at it. If we send an engineer, we get to subtract 1 titanium from the cost. Administrators, on the other hand, have never done an honest day's work in their life. They wouldn't know a wrench if you threw it at them, so they can't actually be sent to this action. And as we said, geniuses count as any worker when taking an action, so we might as well call them engineers and get that discount. Now, since we're here, let's look at the buildings themselves. We've got power plants, which let you go back in time and pay off your future loans, factories, which will get you resources in different ways, life support, which is all about water, and labs, which are kind of a wild card. The cost for each is shown on the leftmost available space, and you can't swap anything out once you've built it, so choose wisely. Most buildings will provide worker or free action spaces, which we've talked about. Some will provide passive bonuses, like this one that improves your ability to time travel, and others will give you a one-time bonus as soon as it's built. Buildings will also be worth points at the end of the game, so keep that in mind. And I'm sure you've noticed by now that this game is one of those with a lot of different symbols. Like this building here will turn 1 water into a titanium, gold, or uranium. I'll be going over some of the most important ones, but you aren't going to memorize them right away, and there's a glossary on the back of the rulebook. Your first couple games, you're going to be looking through it pretty regularly, but I will say that the symbology is pretty intuitive once you get the hang of it. Okay, back to the actions. Now that we've seen how important workers are, let's get some new ones. As you can see, scientists don't know how to talk to people, so they can't come here, and if you send an engineer, they won't be able to recruit a genius, because geniuses are elitist and they won't listen to a common worker, which means that the administrators are your best bet. Regardless, when you take this action, pick an available worker and put them on the active column of your player board. You also get a bonus depending on which worker you recruited. Getting a scientist earns you 2 water, an engineer gets you a power core, and an administrator will net you 1 victory point. A genius will let you choose any of the other 3 bonuses. And keep in mind that the available workers are not kept from round to round. Each time a new card is flipped, the supply is reset. Next up, we have research. Obviously, only scientists are allowed at this club, and this lets you achieve scientific breakthroughs, represented by these tiles. There are 5 different symbols among 3 different shapes, and they're mostly used when building superprojects. Let's look at the superproject from our current era. This grand reservoir requires a few things, but what we care about right now is this breakthrough symbol, which shows a circle of society. When we take the research action, we can take our 2 dice, which have icons or shapes on them, and set one of them to a specific face. The only exception being the wild space on the icon die. That would be too easy. So we set our icon to society and roll the shape die. We get triangle, which isn't what we wanted, but as you can see, we can also spend a triangle and a square of any icon instead of the society circle. So we're halfway there. There's a little more to talk about with superprojects, but I'll come back to them when we get to time travel. Now, those last 3 actions are pretty important, but when each space in a column gets filled up, that doesn't mean you're out of luck. Up above them is the World Council. There are 2 spaces, and each one lets you perform one of the 3 actions below, provided that that action has no available spaces left. So here we would be able to recruit and build, but not research. Any restriction or bonus, such as the titanium discount for engineers who are building, still applies. And lastly, if you take this left council space, you become the first player for the next round. And if that's all you're gunning for, you can place a worker here even if the actions below aren't full. You won't get to perform any actions, but you will get to be first player. Now over on the right side of the board is the mine. This action is nice and easy. When you send a worker here, you take the resource to the right of your worker, so here we get 1 uranium, and then you choose any 1 resource on the left column, which, like the workers, change from era to era. Also, if you send an engineer here, they'll be motivated, meaning that during the cleanup phase, you'll place them in the active column instead of the tired column. On the left side of the board are 2 hex pool actions. On top we have Purify. Here you'll gain 3 water, or 4 if you send Scientist, and below we have Trade. If you have 3 water, you can trade that for 1 power core or 2 gold, uranium, or titanium. Likewise, you can trade 1 power core for 3 water or 1 neutronium, and so on for the rest of them. You only get to make 1 trade per action unless you send an administrator, who can make 2, so they could spend both trades to get neutronium from water. Now, that's all for the main board, so let's look at your player board. We've already gone over the supply and force workers actions, so let's talk about power plants and time travel. Once you build a power plant, you can use it to send things back in time, fulfilling your earlier requests. This is how I'm going to send that joke back in time, but I haven't actually written it down yet, so I can't activate this space. I'll do it later. I'm sure it won't have any big consequences. So let's say we're a few rounds in. We've built some power plants. We got this basic one here. Let us go back one space. So we put down a worker and then we head over to the timeline. We take our focus marker from the current round and move it one space to the left. Now that this era is in focus, we can remove any one warp tile by paying its cost. If it's a resource, just pay it to the bank. If it's an exosuit, it needs to be powered up. And if it's a worker, they must be in your active column. And this is one instance where geniuses don't count as other workers. You have to match the tile. After paying off your time debt, move your time travel marker up one space. But what if you've got more debt to pay off? Well, we've got the second power plant that can move us 2 spaces into the past, but we always count from the current era, so it could only move us back to here. You'll need to get a stronger power plant if you want to go further back in time. Of course, while we're here, maybe we should build one of these super projects. Whenever you take the construct action, instead of a normal building, you can construct a super project, so long as it's in focus and you have the resources and breakthroughs available. Sometimes this will also require you to spend a worker. The Grand Reservoir we were talking about, for example, costs 1 engineer. Again, this is one of those times that geniuses won't cut it. You need the real thing. The engineer can be active or tired so long as they aren't on an action space, but once you spend them, they've devoted themselves to this project and they're gone for good. Place the super project so it covers the 2 leftmost available spaces in a building row. Don't worry about the standard building costs, just pay what the super project asks for. And as with anomalies, you can choose if there are multiple options, but if it won't fit, you can't build the super project. Speaking of anomalies, getting rid of them is an action, but it's a little gloomy. As you can see, it costs 2 resources or 1 neutronium plus 2 water. Then whichever worker you send gets lost, doomed to forever fix the mistakes of your past. And that's actions, but a lot of things are going to change once the impact occurs. Let's talk about that next. At the end of the 4th round, the impact occurs. You can remove the tile if you like, but the effects are inescapable. The most dramatic change is the damage that the meteor deals. Place 2 unavailable tiles on the indicated spaces of your player board. Flip over the evacuation tile on the main board, placing the -3 token on the 2, 3, or 4 space, depending on how many players you have. And lastly, the 3 main action spaces are going to start collapsing. Randomly take these collapsing tiles and use them to cover the appropriate action spaces. So what do all of these changes mean? Let's start at home. While your path's home turf is pretty well protected, it wasn't immune to the effects of the impact. From now on, you can only power up 1 exosuit for free, and the maximum number of exos you can field is 4. Plus, when determining how much water you get for unused spaces, don't count the unavailable ones. Heading back to the main board, there are 3 big changes. Over at the mine, as this symbol reminds us, after the impact, the top resource will always be neutronium, no matter what the mine card says. Over at the top of the board, we see a new hex pool space. This is for evacuation. The people of the capital need a new place to live, and you're going to try to convince them to come home with you. The way you do that is listed on your path board. The top condition refers to what you need to have in order to take the evacuation action. In our case, we need to have built 3 life support buildings, and this will give us 2 points when we evacuate. The real value, though, is in the bottom condition. This shows that we'll get 3 points for each pair of gold and genius that we have. So if we were to evacuate with 3 gold and 4 geniuses, we'd get 11 points total. Of course, we might want to hold off a bit. See, you can only evacuate once per game, and once you evacuate, you place your path marker on the highest available space next to the action to show this. However, you might not want to wait too long because if you're the last player to evacuate, say 4th in a 4-player game, your achievements will be worth 3 fewer points. Lastly, we'll look at those collapsing capital tiles. Each tile will flip over after being used, making that space unavailable for the rest of the game. However, the icons on the tiles represent powerful one-time use abilities for whoever gets there first. This one, for example, lets you build twice in 1 action. However, once all of these tiles have been flipped over, the capital's infrastructure has completely collapsed and the game will end during the cleanup phase of the current round. Or, if you don't use all of the collapsing tiles, the game will end after the 7th round. At the end of the game, you'll have one last chance to fix the timeline. You won't need to use power plants and you won't remove your time travel marker, but you can pay off any and all warp tiles on the timeline if you have the resources, workers, or exosuits available. If you can't, each warp tile is going to net you -2 points, which means I really need to write that joke and send it back in time. I gotta finish the video first. It'll be fine. After you untangle the continuum, it's time to count up your score. First, look at each of the 5 endgame scoring cards and award 3 points to whoever met each condition. The appendix in the back of the rulebook will describe what each one is all about. If players are tied, they'll both get the points. Then add up all points shown on your buildings, super projects, time travel, and morale tracks, and any victory point tokens you earned. Subtract points for each anomaly and warp tokens still on the timeline. And lastly, if you have any breakthroughs left over, those will be worth a point each, plus 2 points for each set of 3 different shapes, regardless of their icons. After adding up all points, whoever has the most will earn their path the new seat of the World Council and win the game. Ties are broken by most water, then most total resources, and if you're still tied after that, it becomes a bicameral legislature and you share the victory. And that's how you play the base game of Anachrony. But, like I said at the top of the video, there are a few modules and alternate game modes to keep things fresh. And if you want to learn about them right now, head on over to my Patreon page and pledge a few bucks. Not only will you get to see the next video a month early, you can get access to more exclusive things like strategy videos and polls for what games I'm teaching next. Speaking of, I filmed this video before the poll concluded, but through the miracle of editing, I can tell you that the next game will be this. Looking forward to it. Now, I feel like there was something else I was supposed to do, but for the life of me, I can't remember what it was.
It probably wasn't important. In any case, thank you for watching. I've been Shay Parker. This has been RTFM, and I'll see you next time. Bye!